Okay, so this is the chapter 3 lecture on migration. Hopefully you guys can see the screen well. I'm trying to talk a little louder because I rewatched the lecture 2 video and it was a little low, so it's always better to be able to turn down the volume, right, than have to turn it up. So as you should have been reading chapter 3, it deals with migration and introduces some important information there in addition to some concepts. So while a lot of these are straightforward, I'm not going to spend too much time on chapter 3. I do want to focus right here, though, on slide number 6, and it's an important distinction we need to make about some key terms. So emigration and immigration, right? So emigration with an E is migrating from a location, meaning that you're leaving the country, right? So you emigrated from Canada, you emigrated from Germany. Immigration with an I is migrating to a location. So in the US, right, we'll say immigrants from Spain, immigrants from the UK, immigrants from China, right? So that's an important distinction to make, especially when we're talking about tracking people's movements, right? So emigration with an E, migrating from, right? And immigration, migrating to. And then net migration is literally just the number of differences between immigrants and the number of emigrants, right? So to how to see like a total of movement of migration. I won't ask you to calculate net migration, so don't worry about that. But if you're interested, slide number 7 indicates how to do that. And really, we want to make those two important distinctions because when we're talking about international migration flows and how we calculate net migration, it's important to understand who's moving, right, and where. Because if we don't, track that kind of migration flow, then that has huge implications. And as far as you know, right, the spatial thinking process, it has all types of complications and consequences and benefits too, right? But social, right, political, economic. So it's important to think about those again. It's going to be repetitive through the entire course as we go through this using those 5 spatial components, but especially when we think about migration. Slide number 12 is about the demographic transition model from chapter 2. And hopefully you're well versed in that by now and all of what all of these um, acronyms mean. And so each stage in the demographic transition is accompanied by a migration transition stage and how people move, right? So when you see migration transition, just think about people's movement, if that helps you remember it. Okay. There's 2 types of international migration, right? So international migration is obviously moving from one country to another, but there's voluntary, which is exactly as it sounds, right? People are choosing to move, they're making a choice. And then there's forced migration, which is different and compelled to move by cultural forces or political forces for environmental or environmental factors. And there's a typo in that. But let's think about certain examples from around the world. Are Syrians during the Syrian crisis, are they voluntary or forced? How about Iraqi refugees, Afghani refugees, right? So when we're attaching the word refugee to it, it's normally accompanied by forced migration because people don't have that choice, right? They're fleeing for safety reasons, not because of economic opportunity or cultural reasons. Then within a country, there's 2 types of internal migration, and that's exactly why it's called internal, right? Within a country. So there's inter-regional, or so I'm sorry, there's a typo here. Let me change it for you right now. From one region to another. So, for example, if you're moving from the southwest to the northeast, right, that's an example of interregional migration, right? But intra-regional is moving within the same region. So, for example, if you live in Hill Country, Texas, you're saying, yeah, I moved from Austin to San Marcos for a job. That would be considered interregional because you're not leaving the same region in which you originally lived, right? And this is usually to urban areas or from older cities to newer cities or to newer suburbs, right? But generally always within the same region, which is intra means within, right? And inter means between. So intra within and inter between. Okay, but people move for different reasons, right? We just talked about forced migration and voluntary migration, economic opportunity, right? Jobs. So we call why people leave their country or why people emigrate, right? Push factors. What's pushing them out of their country? And that's obviously going to be different for a lot of other people, right? Whether that's they're moving for a job relocation, right? They are fleeing for their safety. They're moving to be closer to people of the same culture, right? Those are what we call push factors. Then pull factors are the reasons people immigrate with an I, right? Immigrate to a country. So associate those two, emigration with push, right? And pull um, with immigrate. So why do people immigrate? This usually the same. They're pretty much similar, right, to some of the reasons people emigrate, with the exception of forced movement. But for voluntary movement, that's really why we see most immigration, with the exception of refugees, and we'll talk about them in a second. So refugees are forced to migrate to another country, right, to avoid conflict, situations of violence, human rights violations, or refugees are can sometimes be caused by human disaster, right? We saw, I mean, Katrina. We've seen the Philippines historically has some of the worst natural disasters and is prone to some of the worst natural disasters on Earth because it's a chain of islands in the middle of the ocean and it's near several um, what are they? Fault lines. Yes, fault lines. There you go. That's what I was looking for. But refugees are different than internally displaced persons. So the difference with a refugee is that they leave the country, right? They cross an international border, whereas internally displaced people are just are forced to move, but they stay within the same country. So internally displaced, that should give you your indicator right there, right? Internal, inside. Then there's an asylum seeker. So far, you have refugees, internally displaced persons, and asylum seekers. And yes, those are all different, right? So an asylum seeker is someone who has migrated to another country in hopes of being recognized as a refugee, right? So when we talk about refugee, it's not just people that just choose to migrate, right? There are international laws and countries that define who a refugee is based on what is happening inside their own country, right? We've heard recently in the news Syrian refugees, right? And that's because it's a worldwide. The world is paying attention to it, right? And so there's been counsel on this. People have decided on how to categorize people that are moving for different reasons. And so an asylum seeker, and what we see a lot of that is through the border, even in Texas and Mexico, is that someone wants to be recognized as a refugee, which means they can be categorized as someone fleeing for violent purposes, right? Safety of their life. But as is in most cases with a lot of internally displaced people, it's because of natural disasters for the most part. I'm not saying that internal conflict or political or violent conflict doesn't occur, but certainly most of the internally displaced are because of natural disasters, and it's because a lot of the housing that makes people susceptible to these natural disasters are usually located in floodplains. If you are familiar with San Marcos, if you live in the San Marcos area, then you know San Marcos has also severe floodplains, right? But also desertification, the deterioration of land, right, into non-arable land. And from chapter 1 or 2, it should be the amount of farmable land, right? We covered that. Arable land means the amount of farmable land, and that's typically due to human action, right? Over farming, overdevelopment, right? And so in the U.S. context now, and one of the last few things we're actually going to talk about in this lecture are immigration policies, right? So regardless of how many people want to move and regardless of how many people are moving, it's the immigration policies that ultimately decide who is and who is not considered a refugee, who is and who is not considered, someone who can be an asylum seeker. And most countries have their own U.S. immigration policies in addition to that, right? And so they have certain guidelines on and how long it would take to gain citizenship. So there's a few important ones that I really want to discuss. 1882, right? Historically, the only Immigration and Naturalization Act to ever target a specific ethnic group. And this was, in this case, the Chinese, named by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So that should tell you who this law was targeting. So what it did was it ended all Chinese immigration to the US for at least 10 years. And it was the first immigration act passed by Congress. And although it was renewed 10 years later, right, in 1882, drafted in 1882, renewed in 1892, it was renewed every 10 years until 1943. So if we look from a historical perspective, right, the Chinese have not constituted a major part of the US population until 1965, right? And you might say, well, what happened in 1965? Different immigration policies that allowed for such a diverse mix of people to come to the US and to what we see today. So this next slide is kind of talking about how, during the 1860s and the 70s, when the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, most of the railroad workers were Chinese, and so along with about 20% Irish. So Irish and the Chinese constituted mostly the Transcontinental Railroad labor force. But because so many Chinese were employed in the railroad, it prevented a lot of white people from getting jobs, right? And mainly because the labor was so cheap that the Chinese were willing to work, right, for much lower wages than white Americans were. Sounds a little familiar today. But the end result was that capitalism won and the Chinese Exclusion Act got passed to end Chinese immigration, right? But what happens in all economies, right? You have a downturn and then you have an uptick, right? It's a cyclic relationship of up and down in an economy. So usually when the economy is on a downturn, that's usually when the most recently or newest immigrants to a country are blamed for the economic downfall, right? We see that in the US media with Mexicans, right? People coming from Mexico are taking US jobs. You see the same thing in places like Sweden, where they've accepted a large number of Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees. And now that the Swedish economy is also on somewhat of a downturn, the recently arrived immigrants are the first ones to blame. I'm going to illustrate to you how and why this has become a pattern in the US and how it's been instituted through policy and law. So this is just elaborating on what I just said about the cyclic relationships, right? But now we need to turn to the actual laws, right, and see what they've done. So 1924, called the National Origins Act. And so in 1924, 2% of every ethnicity in the US was allowed to emigrate each year. Now, let's think about that. 1924, who were the majority of people in the US in 1924 that make up the overwhelming majority of people, right? White people. It's not people of color. It's not minorities. So if they say, okay, 2% from Germany can immigrate, 2% from Norway, 2% from England, 2% from France, 2% from Sweden, 2% from Finland, right? These are all white European countries, and 2% of their population in 1924 was much higher than any person of colors or a minority. So this was one way that Congress enacted a law to try to keep the U.S. Favoring European immigration. Then in 1934, we have the Tydings-McDuffie Act. And so this one targeted Filipino immigrants. But let's back cap a little bit because there's a gap between 1924 and 1934. And what happened there? Yes, right, the Great Depression. And so as the economy is getting worse in 1924, you can see that these policies have been enacted to favor white Europeans. But after the Great Depression, right, the economy starts to pick up again. And so the US wants cheap labor. It's a capitalist society, right? And so when the US wants cheap labor, who are they turning to? Well, they were originally turning to the Chinese, but the 1882, Exclusion Act eliminated Chinese immigration. And so the US turns its eyes to the Philippines because the U.S. has a history with the Philippines that I'm not going to get too much into in this, but basically they were a colony of the United States up until 1941. So, getting back to this, the U.S. government at the time argued that there were too many Filipinos in the U.S. and they were taking too many jobs, and so they drafted this act, the Tidings-McDuffie Act, in 1934, and they said, okay, only 50 Filipinos can immigrate to the U.S. per year. That's the size of this class online. But in addition, excuse me, it was 1941. The independence of the Philippines in 1941, right? So what this act said is, okay, we're going to limit the immigration to 50, but at the same time, we're going to give independence to the Philippines a few years after, right? The 1952 Act kept this same quota system in place since 1924. So imagine now 30 years are going by, and you still have these same restrictive policies saying 2% of this, 2% of that, 2% of this. So 1952 kept that same system, but it used a different data set for it. So instead of the 1910 census as before, right? I'm just trying to find the slide. Yeah, estimating using the 1910 census, right? So they said, okay, 30 years later, we'll use a 20-year-old data set. So most of that quota allocation went to Ireland, the UK, and Germany, right, as we were saying before. So really nothing changed. But here is when we see a major change in the ethnic composition of the US. The 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act. So you need to know this 100%. And it did three very important things. So number one, it abolished that quota system. So no more 2% of this, 2% of that. There was just a national quota with a cap, right? And it said, okay, 700,000 people, no matter where they're from. But it also instilled a preference for skilled labor. And so workers with skills were the given priority as far as U.S. immigration was concerned. But it also favored family reunification. And family reunification, for example, was not included in the annual limits. So for example, say 1 million people for the year emigrated to the US, and then those 1 million people were able to bring 4 family members each, right? So 5 million people. Only 1 million is counted as immigration because, right, one of the benefits at the time was that it permitted family reunification. And that was not counted in the annual limits of the overall national quota. So I want you to know that. Then the last one, 1990. So it modified and expanded that 65 Act, but it significantly increased the total immigration limit to 700,000, but it increased the visas by 40%. So what the 1990 Act really did was it put emphasis on H-1B workers, right? Temporary skilled workers, workers that were not meant to stay in the US but could, right, given the fact that they retain employment. So again, the 1990 Act increased the number of H-1B visas, which increased the number of highly skilled migrants in the US. The rest of these slides, don't worry, this was just a slide that I had, kind of illustrating the effects of the immigration laws through time, and in a case study that I worked on in Jersey City, New Jersey, comparing 2 Asian groups through times of entry, like right when they came, right, and the total years and the total personal income on this table here. But there's a ton of variables that you could go through, and that I have if you're interested in that. So please check out the discussion on chapters 1 and 3, and now hopefully by this time I've created the chapter 3 discussion. Just use that if you're having any questions about anything, or if you can't send an email or you want to get input from a classmate, feel free to do that. And I hope that you guys utilize the discussion boards, and I hope that this lecture was helpful conceptualizing how immigration policy has really impacted the ethnic composition of the U.S.